let's start out with what a Puritan is. Let's see if we can kind of define a Puritan. And to start this out, I'm actually going to give you a quote by a famous American author and journalist. His name was H.L. Mencken. And Mencken was not exactly someone who necessarily believed in the gospel, but Mencken was someone who looked at Christians and saw some of our silliness and was able to kind of reflect it back to us, especially when we get serious about ourselves. But one of the things that Mencken said about Puritans was this. He said, a Puritan is someone who is fearful of someone somewhere else having fun and will do everything to stop it. That's kind of the typical view of Puritans. The Puritans were these grumpy people who always wore black, and somehow the sky over them was always cloudy, and these people never liked to smile, they never laughed, they just sat around all day, I don't know, reading their Bible or something like that, but only reading the really darker parts, or the really sad parts of the Bible, the parts that kind of remind you of how dire and dark you are. The truth about the Puritans is that's not really accurate. If you go back and look at what they wore, for example, they wore bright colors. In fact, they often were lovers of great clothing. In fact, this is the day and age where men would wear lace, which may sound a little strange to you now here in the 21st century, but the Puritans loved things like expensive, finely woven lace. And it wasn't the fact that they were somehow obsessed with things of finer taste, it just means that they loved things that were beautiful. The Puritans were known for having feasts. After all, it was the Puritans, for example, who founded that Feast of Thanksgiving along with the natives here in the New World. The Puritans were a people who loved things like beautiful poetry or beautiful paintings. The very first poet in the New World was a Puritan woman by the name of Anne Bradstreet. The Puritans also loved things like beer. The largest cargo that they brought over on the Mayflower was a huge barrel of beer, partly because it would keep well, and also partly because they used that as a form of celebration. It's one of the things that actually kept half of them alive during that first winter over here in the New World. So in reality, the Puritans weren't this people group that were somehow always dour, somehow always sad and depressed. The Puritans just understood the pattern of life. In other words, they understood the fact that you have times of confession, you have times where you fast, but you also have times where you profess that God has done all of these things for us. He's taken away the penalty of sin, which is death. And you also celebrate that. So kind of like our year, we have times where we fast and we have times where we feast. We have times where we work and we have times where we rest. The Puritans understood that problem, or that pattern rather, not a problem, but that pattern very well, and they tried to adapt it constantly. To give you a simple definition of what a Puritan is, and I've shown you what a Puritan is not, a Puritan was simply someone who wanted to purify the church. That's where they got their name. They took a look at the way that worship was being done in the Church of England. They took a look at the way that sermons were allowed to be preached, because at this time, the King or Queen of England always had their hand on the church. In fact, they were seen as the head of the church, and they could control how worship was done. They could control what you said from the pulpit as a pastor, and they could even control what parts of the Bible were in English versus what parts were still in Latin. So the Puritans took a look at the way that the king or the queen controlled the church, and they thought that that really was not a good model. They thought it was a bad model to have the same person in charge of the state and in charge of the church. And that actually was a common model for all Protestants. It was always this idea that the state and the church should be ruled by different people. That's what's originally meant by separation of church and state. You don't want the same people in charge of both because it's too much power, it's too much influence, and there's no way to check them if they go wrong. However, you do want truth and beauty and goodness to be informing both the church and the state. That really was always there as an idea in the way the Puritans thought, and the way the Protestants thought, and the way the early Americans thought as well.